With your attack, you've activated my trap card!
This right here, this is the essence of Yu-Gi-Oh! You're about to win the game, and then you proceed to step on a series of rakes. Trap cards have given players the chance to survive to the next turn for nearly 20 years. They help us interact with our opponents at nearly any point in the game. The mere sight of a face down can scare opponents and keep them a safe distance away from your life points.
He's just standing there, menacingly!
And they're not wrong to fear the power of the trap card. Cards like Mirror Force and Torrential Tribute will nuke the field. The Solemn cards are hard stops to most individual effects. There are floodgates to prevent people from playing altogether. Hi, I'm Adam from Baton Pass Gaming. In this video, we're going to take a look at how trap cards have influenced the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Throughout the years. This is a brief history of trap cards. Let's begin with an overview on how trap cards work. Trap cards are the reddish-purplish cards. They generally need to sit on the field for a turn before they can be activated. Some traps have specific activation requirements that must be met before they can be flipped, like a monster being summoned or an attack declared. This plays into the thematic nature of a trap. There are tripwires that are sprung when they're least expected. There are 3 types of traps. Normal and continuous reach spell speed 2, which means they can be activated during any phase in any player's turn, and they can be activated in response to other cards as part of a chain link. Counter traps are the fastest cards in the game at spell speed 3, meaning only other spell speed 3 effects can be activated in response to them, which basically is just another counter trap card. The Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game made its debut in North America in March 2002. The first booster pack was Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon, followed weeks later by the Yugi and Kaiba starter decks. Normal monsters ruled the game like Lejin, Mystical Genie of the Lamp, and Summon Skull. If you were on the receiving end of one of these monsters, you only had a couple options to defend yourself. Waboku was probably the most useful. Waboku, Wabaku, jury's still out on pronunciation. I'm calling it Waboku. This card basically guarantees your monsters and your life points are safe for the turn it's activated. There was direct removal in the form of Trap Hole and 2-pronged attack. You could change stats with reinforcements, castle walls, and reverse trap. You could inflict burn damage with just desserts, or just throw out more monsters with Ultimate Offering. And then there's Dragon Capture Jar, which capture dragons, turns them into defense mode. It was good enough it inspired a direct counter in the form of Dragon Piper. Being able to stop your opponent's momentum would become a crucial selling point for Yu-Gi-Oh! This is a game where just surviving to the next turn can mean the difference between winning or losing. This game is all about good top decks, and your deck is full of them. You can easily turn the tables of a round if you can just draw that next card. So keeping your opponent from snowballing out of control is essential. A well-timed interruption can totally throw off their groove.
No! You threw off my groove!
The next booster pack was Metal Raiders, and it blessed us with some of the strongest traps in the game. Mirror Force is the iconic trap card, and for good reason. For at least 10 years after its debut, players would be checking graveyards for this card before entering the battle phase, making sure to turn their monsters to defense mode to avoid the ultimate punish. There's nothing that feels worse than getting baited into losing all your monsters to a single Mirror Force. Fun fact, Mirror Force was so good that it was limited to 1 on the July 2002 ban list, not even a full week after it was released. Metal Raiders also introduced counter traps to the game. They were focused on negating individual cards. Magic Jammer and 7 Tools of the Bandit are hard stops to spell and trap cards respectively. Horn of Heaven is like a souped up trap hole, but instead of merely destroying its target, it negates the summon altogether. That means it's like it never landed on the field, which is an important point to make with regards to a certain android we'll talk about later. And then there's Solemn Judgment, a card that'll always likely be relevant as either a playable card or as a shorthand reference to communicate how other cards behave. It's the first Omni-Negate in the game. It stops summons, it stops spells, and it stops traps. And because it's cost us half your life points, it's always live because you'll always have the life points to spend. Unfortunately for trap cards, Metal Raiders also brought Heavy Storm into the world. This is basically a dark hole for the back row, but it hits traps especially hard. This is because traps need to be on the field for at least a turn before they can be activated, which often makes them sitting ducks for back row removal. This dynamic makes trap cards a unique feature of the card game. Compared to a game like Magic, where instants can be played straight from your hand during either player's turn, provided you can pay the mana cost. You don't need to commit an instant card to the battlefield. It can stay safely in your hand until the time is right. Compare that to Yu-Gi-Oh!, where trap cards need to be set on the field for at least a turn before their activation windows are met. The threat of losing all your cards by committing them to the field to a single card like Heavy Storm is a massive deterrent to just throwing everything on the board. Kinda like how Mirror Force acts as a deterrence for monsters. You don't want to attack with all your monsters because there's the threat you'll lose them all in that one go. It's here in the game we start to see the foundations of the play, counterplay mechanics that will eventually become a key part of the game's most enjoyable formats. This inherent weakness of trap cards will be exploited in the next couple sets. Spell Ruler introduced more back row hate in the forms of Giant Trunade and Mystical Space Typhoon. Trunade is like a watered down version of Heavy Storm, but effectively functions the same as it removes back row for the turn. Mystical Space Typhoon is among the first class of quick play spells in the game, and is a simple 1-for-1 trade with another spell or trap. MST in particular is super unfortunate for continuous trap cards, such as the only real notable trap from Magic Ruler, Spellbinding Circle. Continuous cards need to remain on the field after activation to resolve successfully, so if MST is chained to it and destroys it before it resolves, then it fizzles, which is not a technical term, but it communicates the idea pretty well. Nothing happens. It just leaves the field, it's gone.
Fugazi, Fugazi, it's a wazi, it's a woozy, it's a fairy dust.
This is the origin of the phrase MST negates. These three forms of generic back row removal impose a huge complication for traps. If a card is likely to get blown up before it can be activated, then it loses a lot of playability. Battle traps like Mirror Force, while powerful, can only be activated after an attack is declared, so it's got a narrow activation window making it more vulnerable to removal. Compare it to something like Waboku, which can be activated at any point during the turn and still have an impact on the game state. This makes cards like Waboku chainable, as they can be activated in response to back row removal and still resolve properly, which makes for a more favorable trade for the player with the trap, because not only do you still get your effect, but you also make your opponent lose a card in the process. And in Yu-Gi-Oh!, the cards themselves are the most valuable resource a player can have, so nickel and diming your opponent on these interactions is pretty good. It's worth noting that the threat of a trap card is often enough to discourage players from committing to the field in the first place. Nobody wants to walk into a Mirror Force and lose all their monsters. So some players will either play conservatively or wait until they can remove the threat. Bluffing is a huge part of what makes trap cards in the game work. You can turn any spell or trap, even if they're not useful in that moment, into a bluff, and scare your opponent into making a suboptimal play. It's a mind game that adds an extra layer of intrigue. The last core set to be released in 2002 is Pharaoh's Servant, and this is where trap cards begin to take center stage. This set single-handedly introduced 42 unique traps to the game, which is a lot considering that in all the product released up to this point, there are only 25 unique traps, and 3 of them were locked behind a video game and tournament packs. Some of the more notable highlights of the set are Imperial Order, one of the more infamous floodgates of all time with the ability to just turn off spells for as long as it's on the field. Its original printing was especially broken because it had a built-in off switch, so after denying your opponent the use of spells for a turn, you could just stop paying for it and proceed with your own. Gravity Bind was a monster-flavored floodgate that countered the aggressive level 4-centered metagame. Ceasefire would approach staple status for its huge potential to burn for thousands of life points on a single card, and also having the ability to stop flip effects from activating. And Dust Tornado is more back row hate, which would see more play after Mystical Space Typhoon got limited to 1. But there's a shadow hanging over all of these amazing traps, and it belongs to the one and only Android Psycho Shocker itself, Jinzo. Jinzo is a powerful 1 tribute monster with a basic effect. It negates all traps on the field. No trap hole, no mirror force. Its presence on the board instantly simplifies the game state. Its existence is a hard check for any trap-reliant strategy, because if it's not dealt with as soon as it hits the field, it's basically game over. Interacting with it on your opponent's turn would be limited to the strengths of your quick play spells, which at this point in the game aren't very common. Your options were limited to either Rush Recklessly or Limiter Removal, and both of those cards assume you have a strong enough monster or a machine on the field. Limiter Removal is especially insidious because Jinzo itself is a machine, so it can easily swing for game if left unchecked. And despite requiring a tribute to summon, it's incredibly accessible. It's got a perfect 1500 defense stat, so it's searchable via Witch of the Black Forest. You can discard it and revive it from the graveyard with Monster Reborn, or with either of the 2 new revival cards that came out in this set, Premature Burial and Call of the Haunted. Jinzo even has a cool interaction with Call of the Haunted, as once it hits the field it'll negate it, meaning it's no longer tethered to it, which makes Call of the Haunted a pseudo-chainable trap card if Jinzo's your target. The only trap cards that could stop Jinzo at this time are counter traps like Horn of Heaven or Solemn Judgment, because they can specifically negate its summon, preventing its effect from applying because it never successfully landed onto the field. I believe the introduction of Jinzo, and eventually cards like Royal Decree and Harpy's Feather Duster later in the game, will give Konami the confidence they needed to create more unique, game-warping trap cards at lower rarities. I don't need to remind you of how good Torrential Tribute is, or Ring of Destruction, but those cards were initially pretty high in rarity and expensive. After the likes of Jinzo were released, we got to see better trap cards get lower rarity prints, which I think ultimately made the game more accessible to the masses. Bottomless Trap Hole was a rare in Legacy of Darkness, and is debatably better than Torrential Tribute, depending on the situation, as it banishes the monster instead of sending it to the graveyard. Compulsory Evacuation Device was also a rare, this time from Invasion of Chaos, and would achieve near staple status in the early 2010s as an efficient way to get extra deck monsters off the field and keep them out of the graveyard. Sakuretsu Armor was a watered-down mirror force, but wasn't limited, so it kept your opponent guessing as to what your back row was. Trap Dust Shoot was a common from Pharaonic Guardian, and it lets you mess with your opponent's hand and gives you valuable knowledge of what they had. As for myself, my favorite trap card happens to be a low rarity one, Phoenix Wing Wind Blast. It's aged like a fine wine. Chef's kiss. For the decks that can play it well, the discard cost might not even be a cost. It's useful to load up your graveyard with monsters or things that you could revive later. It also denies your opponent the luxury of drawing a new card, as you've effectively locked them out of their deck by recycling something they've already used. It's also pretty versatile. It can target monsters, spells, or traps on the field. It's good. It's good. Here in 2022, trap cards function differently than they have in the past. As the game has gotten faster, trap cards are often left behind as their inherent slowness makes them more vulnerable than ever to removal. Add to that, their original role was creating friction for your opponent. This is often done better by monsters with quick effects, namely hand traps. They may not be high impact on their own, but they can be activated straight from the hand, just like those instants from Magic. This means if you lose the die roll and are forced to go second, you can still interact with your opponent and not automatically lose the game. You can still stop your opponent from making big plays. Today, the highest impact trap cards are more proactive or have long-lasting effects. Let's take a look at some floodgates, which are incredibly powerful because they impose new rules on the game that can throw entire decks out of whack. In certain matchups, they're basically instant win buttons. Royal Oppression and Vanity's Emptiness were checks to decks that relied on special summoning, but because that's basically all the decks, these cards were deemed too good and are currently sitting on the forbidden list. Summon Limitless is like a watered-down version of these cards, but if a deck needs to summon more than twice to get going, then it effectively accomplishes the same thing. Rivalry of Warlords and Gozen Match punish decks for their diversity, restricting them to only having one type or one attribute on the field. There can be only one does the same thing but in the opposite direction, making life harder for decks that are overly reliant on a single typing. Macrocosmos has been limited to one for what seems like forever, and can also stop several decks cold by locking them out of their graveyards. Fun fact, a card like Solemn Warning can stop Macrocosmos because Macrocosmos includes the effect of summoning from the deck. The more you know. Dimensional Barrier is a different kind of floodgate because it isn't as vulnerable to back row removal like a lot of the other continuous cards. When it's activated, its effect lingers through to the end of the turn, meaning you can shotgun it at the beginning of a turn, or you can chain it in response to a fusion or ritual spell to prevent it from resolving. Skill Drain negates all monsters while they're on the field. This is a really fun floodgate because it's one of those that seems simple in application, but actually has some layers of interactivity. It negates monster effects, but only while those monsters are on the field, which means there are a lot of ways around it. The classic example is a recruiter monster like Sangan, which gets its effect when it leaves the field and goes to the graveyard. Skill Drain can't stop this because it's not face up on the field anymore. A newer example would be something like Access Code Talker. Skill Drain would prevent most of its effects, except for its destruction ability, because if Access Code Talker banishes itself from the field for its effect, as it is a Dark Link monster, then it can remove Skill Drain and properly resolve, because it's no longer face up on the field. Skill Drain is one of those floodgates that normally always has some kind of meta relevance. In the case of Skill Drain vs Jinzo, the winner is whatever hits the field first. So if Skill Drain is on the field and Jinzo's summoned, then Jinzo's effects are negated. So we'll count that as a win for Skill Drain. That's pretty neat. And lastly for the floodgates, there's Imperial Order and Anti-Spell Fragrance. We've already talked about IO, but Anti-Spell Fragrance serves a similar function in that it stops your opponent from activating spells for at least a turn, which can buy you enough time to win the game with an adequate follow-up. While floodgates are probably the most popular traps played from a competitive point of view, there is a case to be made for counter traps, especially the Solemn Brigade. We've already talked about Solemn Judgment, but it inspired more counter traps that follow in its footsteps, all requiring a life point cost of some kind, and all negate and destroy their targets, with some variation. Solemn Warning can negate a summon or card that includes the effect of special summoning, for the mere cost of 2,000 life points. At the beginning stages of a game, this card costs less life than Judgment, and it can also hit monster effects that include the act of special summoning, something that Judgment cannot. Solemn Scolding is in some ways the most versatile of the Solemn cards, but also the most restrictive. It needs to be the only set card on your side of the field, and for 3,000 life points, you can negate a summon, a spell or trap, or a monster effect. It has the widest application for any of the Solemn cards, but also the steepest cost and has more requirements than the others. And lastly, there's Solemn Strike, which is my personal favorite of the group. Strike costs just 1,500 life points and can hit special summons or monster effects. Unlike the others, it can't stop a normal summon, but it can stop monster effects, which is a huge part of the modern metagame. And the life point cost is low enough that it's live more often than not, even during the late stages of the game. It's also pretty good if you're going second, because chances are your opponent is going to activate a monster effect on their turn, giving you the opportunity to negate and destroy it. Now, I don't want you to leave this video thinking that trap cards are dead in the game. They cycle in and out of formats as metas evolve. And as counters to them rise, their usage drops. But as their usage drops, the counters, those drop too, thus giving them a chance to come back again. It's an endless cycle. It's also worth noting that debatably the best hand trap in the game is also a normal trap card, Infinite Impermanence. It checks nearly all the boxes. It's proactive because you can activate it straight from your hand during either player's turn. Its biggest competitor is Effect Veiler, which can only be used during your opponent's main phase, so it's a huge improvement over that. As a bonus, if you set it on the field and activate it, It'll also negate all the spells and traps within its column, giving it more utility as back row negate. It's great for when you need to turn off a floodgate for a turn, or if your opponent makes a mistake and activates a card in the same column after it was activated. Trust me, I do this all the time. It comes up more than you think. Infinite Impermanence is the best of all worlds, and a nice callback to the traps of old. I like trap cards a lot. I think they're really fun. My favorite formats are formats like Goat or Edison or Hat, where, you want 6 to 8 to 10 good trap cards in your deck that could just let you counterplay with your opponent. That play-counterplay dynamic is so important to the game because you never feel like you're completely shut out if you have an answer to something. Now it's time for me to activate Magic Cylinder and ask you, the audience, what are some of your favorite trap cards in the game? What are some of your most memorable trap card stories, where you think you're about to win the game, only to step on the series of rakes? Or where you're about to lose a game, but come back thanks to a well-timed trap? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, please let me know by subscribing to my channel. Once again, my name is Adam and you're watching Baton Pass Gaming. Thanks for watching.